Hello, everyone, and welcome back to your third Matriculate webinar for April. This is Murab, excited to be back with you all and give you more advice and content to own. Especially now as we've finally begun pairing across campuses. This is really exciting, but really from all of us, I would want to say thank you. Despite all the uncertainty of everything we've faced on a day-to-day basis, seeing your everyday commitment to just do this work is incredibly meaningful, and all of us as a staff are just incredibly lucky to work with you. And with that said, as we kind of like keep chugging along into our curriculum and going into the work that you're doing with students, something that will still be relevant for you in the next few months, we're going to take a deeper dive into the personal statement / college essay. So here's our end goal and agenda with this webinar. Really just what we want you to leave with today is being able to understand the elements of what makes an effective college essay, some sample brainstorming topics to get you going, and just how, in essence, can you really edit effectively. For reference, we have these 2 units in the curriculum base for you to also reference and check before you get started with working on the personal statement with your student. I'm also insanely here for this and excited for to introduce 2 guest speakers joining our webinar. First up is Corinne Smith, a senior assistant director at Yale's undergraduate admissions office. And then second, we have Eddie Chobanu, also from Yale, and an assistant director of undergraduate admissions as well. So with that said, I'm really excited for them to kick us off for our sequence on the college essay and admissions.
Hi everyone, this is Eddie here. Thank you so much for all of the great work you do as well, especially in these really uncertain and turbulent times. It's just that much more important. Your commitment is that much more important, and all of us on behalf of admission staff everywhere, and then I know Matriculate staff as well, are really grateful for your dedication, your dedicated service. Corinne and I are excited to talk a little bit more about the college essay and how it relates to the admissions process, how it fits in, and then we'll also go into some of the mechanics as well, some more detailed big picture and then more detailed conversations. We'll all be chiming in as we go along, so thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start here by just talking about the college essay and how it relates to the admissions process, how it fits into the big picture. When we are thinking of how we approach the essay, we're really mindful of learning from the student in their own words. It's a really exciting opportunity for us as readers of these applications to hear directly from the student, hear what they want to convey about themselves. It's open-ended. Students can certainly answer some prompts, which we'll cover, but what the student chooses to write about is really up to them, and whatever resonates with them, whatever they feel compelled to write. And that's what makes it exciting for us as readers. We get to hear such different and unique perspectives. We get to hear what is most relevant and what's most salient to the student. And so ultimately the goal of this is for us to learn more about who this student is, who it is that we're reading about. This will be a really central question in our admissions process. We're trying to get to best know the student and how they can then fit into each campus community, how they can plug into different communities, whether it be extracurriculars, whether it be academic, clubs and organizations all around the campus, as well as the involvement in the surrounding community. We're really trying to identify the students who could really come and make an impact. And so that's sort of what we're always mindful of. We also are paying attention to a lot of different factors in the essay, and so we'll touch on this as well as we go on. One thing that we are curious about and want to learn about is also the students' level of writing and level of engagement in the writing process. Students are going to be expected to do a lot of writing in college, regardless of what their academic major is. And so we want students, and especially at Yale, we expect students to graduate from our institution knowing how to write clear and convincing arguments, knowing how to communicate their thoughts well, effectively, concisely. And so this is not an academic paper that students are writing, so I want to be clear there. But we also just want to see general writing skill in the essays that students are writing.
I would add to that point that we know that as matriculate advisors, you all are amazing and great writers, and that's what you're here to help with. But it doesn't do any of these students a service to elevate their writing to your level if they're not there. We're going to come back to this point a lot in this presentation, that it should really be the student's own ability and voice. And again, we'll dive into what that means. But changing the essay or editing it so much that it's beyond what they're capable of just means that when they get into an institution that they may be at a deficit. So we definitely want to keep in mind that we on the admissions side want to see that they can write at a college level, but as an advisor, you should be making sure that the essays that they're writing and the schools that they're applying to with those essays are at the level that they can handle.
I also think it's like something that you guys can just see right away too, right? When a student has like definitely has like lost their voice in a personal statement,
Yes.
and so definitely hear that and definitely feel that you guys have like such a good handle on when to see that and when to know when it's happening.
Oh yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll write on a card that I'm evaluating, I had to thesaurus what all this meant and look it up. And so if it's overly thesaurus, you have to realize that we're real people too. And my vocabulary is all right, but I don't know all those SAT words.
Cool.
And more so that we want to really be able to identify sort of the characteristics and the qualities of students and how they would fit in, as I mentioned earlier, with the community. We want to be able to tease out major themes, learn more about the students' interests, the things that they really care about, the things that they're really passionate about. And so those all speak to the student's character, that speaks to their ambition. And those are things that get us excited. We want to get excited about the students so that we can then present them to the admissions committee and get everyone else excited in the way that we are. And so we hope to see these characteristics that would fit in well with our community. We want to see that students can clearly articulate something that they're passionate about, whatever that is. The beauty of the college environment is that students care so deeply about so many different issues. And whatever that means for each student is what we hope for them to communicate. We will certainly talk about some essay topics, but whatever it is that each student really cares about, the way that they communicated, the excitement in which they communicated, that's also going to be an important factor in this process. And just the level of writing as well, we can tell, as we were just discussing, what a 17-year-old's writing is compared to a 40-year-old professional writer or the thesaurus substituted essay. We can tell when things don't match up, not only in the essay, but in other parts of the application as well. So keep in mind that while we're talking about the essay specifically here, admission officers have this overarching view of the entire application. And so we hear when a teacher says, this is one of the best writers in my class. And when we hear that and we see the writing matches up with that, maybe a student is a little bit more of a creative writer and they take some risks. We see that and we love that because it then matches up with other pieces that we see evidence in the application. And so whatever is genuine to the student is what is important for us. If we somehow see signals in other essays, supplemental essays that are not strong writing samples, and then we somehow see a glorious personal statement, we might have some questions. What happened there? Who may have edited or touched this piece of writing, and what does it look like? Ultimately, the schools that students will be applying to, and I love Matriculate because they are, Matriculate is sending all the best students to all the best colleges. And so these are competitive colleges. These are schools that are looking to that have so many academically qualified students in their applicant pool, and it really does make the decision hard for us as well as all the other colleges as well. But we want to see things coming together. And so an exciting part of that will be the writing component and how that does fit in with the rest of the student's application. So part of that is the college essay. There are different writing samples that admission officers have access to. Obviously, the longer personal statement is what a lot of students spend time writing on. The most important or most salient part of what they want to communicate with us, what they want us to know and ensure that we know about them. This is a really great opportunity to give a personal insight into the student's life. Again, as we talked about, that'll be helpful for us to then connect that student to places that we can see them thriving on our campus community. This generally is, students generally spend the most time on this, given that it's the longest piece of writing. And there's a lot of space allotted. I think it's about 650 words allotted to develop a story over that span. And so it's helpful when it's thoughtful, when it's reflective, and it conveys something about the student, whether it's their experience, their perspective, the way they see the world. Those are all things that are going to be important. Now, I know there are some schools that offer school-specific essays. Oftentimes students may not look at those schools because they don't want to write additional additional supplemental essays, but they can be extremely helpful, and they are just as important as the longer personal statement essay. The school-specific essays will vary. They're unique to each institution. A lot of schools will generally have some version of a why our institution, and that's just an opportunity for the student to share a little bit more about how they would play a role in the community, to make it very clear to the admission officer how they would really be impactful. And so they are just as important, I will mention, despite their shorter length. They can vary in ranges as well. Some schools may have a 100-word limit, other schools might have a 250-word limit. Again, it varies by institution. But the important thing here that I'll mention as well is that these supplemental essays help students see what the values of the institution are. So even if a student doesn't end up applying to a school with a supplemental essay, it can actually help in the college search process by reviewing a school's supplemental statement, asking what the school wants to learn about, seeing what it is that the students care about. And so I'll give an example for Yale specifically. One of our, we have a few supplemental essays, but one of them, for example, just a quick one is you're teaching a course at Yale. What is it called? And tell us a little bit about that. We want to see that kind of curiosity, that intellectual engagement. That's just one example where students go in so many different directions with that. They tell us what they're most passionate about academically. And so it's really neat for us to be able to read that and gain a little bit of an insight into the way the student thinks and into their interests and passions.
Yeah, I think that Eddie really hit the nail on the topic. I'm sure that you all will talk a lot more about these school-specific essays as you get further in the process. A lot of times the students will spend all of their time or most of it and their thoughts and effort on that big personal statement, especially because it is something you can start in advance even before you build out that college list. But there's a couple of things I just wanted to say in terms of that. When schools, and even at Yale, like when we try and figure out if a student is a fit for our institution, it's often some of those smaller pieces about community or academic interests or why XYZ school that we turn to rather than the large personal statement. So it's really important. We read a lot of things on Reddit or College Confidential that say, oh, I phoned that in the night before. Do emphasize that these are equally, if not more important than the big essay. And then also make sure that the students' style and quality of writing matches from that personal statement to those smaller or school-specific essays. Usually a lot of effort is put into the first one, a lot of editing, time, spell checking, and then when they get to the shorter pieces, they've done it at the last minute or they don't think that they need eyes on it. And we on the admission side do tend to see a big difference in the quality and style of writing between them.
I think this is such a like perfect transition to our next slide too, because obviously you are reading this as like a part of like holistic admissions. And so I'm kind of excited to hear this next bit about just like how those essays, in addition to the application, and how really the personal statement is part of like a student's personal narrative.
Absolutely. So an official hello, I'm Corinne, everybody. Welcome to my apartment in quarantine in Chicago. So happy to be here. Addie and I have been partnering and working with Matriculate for a few years now. This is actually my 4th year as our admissions liaison. So I love doing this type of work with you all. But in terms of kind of picking that personal statement and figuring out what the high school fellow's personal narrative is, this really does tend to be one of the most difficult and stressful parts of the process. Because of what I mentioned, that it is sort of the first thing that they're able to do. It is what everyone talks about online or on TV or anything else. It's what they've seen other people stress over. And it's really kind of on you that you're there to give the students some guidance how to choose what they are interested in writing about. And if they can get over that hurdle, it really does make everything a little bit more smooth. I often tell students when they're stuck, if you weren't there and someone was describing you, what would they say? That's probably the type of thing that the admissions officers want to know. And it really can enhance the narrative that we're talking about and bring context to the admissions office. The biggest piece of advice that I can give to every single student that applies is that they should not try to be unique. There's such an idea out there that this personal narrative, their story, what they're expressing has to be the most unique thing about them. But the reality is that this is the biggest misconception of the process. When we receive 30 or 35 or 40 or 100,000 applications a year, truly no one is unique, and that should not be the goal. The goal is that the student should tell their story, what's most important to them or most interesting about them, to someone, an admissions officer, who is a real person. And so your goal as a Matriculate fellow and as an advisor is to really figure out what that personal narrative is, figure out what the story is. Sometimes the first things that they brainstorm or the first thing that they write to paper might just be hinting at what the actual story is. This has happened so many times to me where I'm helping someone with an essay and the 4th paragraph of a 6 or 7 paragraph essay is actually the story, and I'll just say restart with this as the center of it. And it's okay if it takes a couple of drafts for that to happen. Addie, I heard you ming along. Do you have anything to add to that?
That is such a great point. And it underscores the importance of starting early and ensuring that this is a process. And I know that you would never allow your student to wait last minute to get started on their essays, but really encouraging students that this is a process. This is the writing process required and the reflection that's needed to really boil it down to what it is that they will really want to write about. And that takes time and that takes effort. It is hard, it is difficult. But I think oftentimes a lot of students, and maybe I'll just speak for myself, in high school, I was just used to writing one draft of a paper and submitting it and thinking that I was done, right? And I I hope I'm sure I'm not the only one who who thought that way as well. But that's sort of what I think what students are sometimes up against, and especially advisors are up against, is that mentality of just the first thing that I write will be the final product. When, exactly as Corinne was describing, there might be a kernel in there that is actually the most important part, and then that's what's worth expanding on. So it's helpful to try to ask those questions to find what that kernel is. And it might take a few drafts. It's an iterative process where it's going to take some time and it's going to take work for students to be able to identify, and for advisors to be able to identify in the students what exactly that is.
Yeah, my first year in admissions, my mentor at the time said something that I'll never forget. He told me that it was my job as an admissions officer to be a document detective, to figure out the story behind the story, the question behind the question, and really get to the heart of it. And so as admissions officers, I think that's what we do every day when we read files. We're not just reading what's on the paper, we're trying to figure out what's behind it and who that student is and who they would be on our campus. So as an advisor and a mentor, if you guys can think of yourselves as that first step of the document detective and drawing that out, it makes our job a little bit easier to understand the student later on.
Yeah, and I actually think that goes in a lot to this next piece too, about I think what our advisors have the most of when looking at other college access providers is that they have capacity. And when you have like 1 to 4 students, I think the thing that is really impactful here is that they could really spend time helping students find that kernel, right? And so like that is like the biggest moment of leverage that advising fellows can have here, in being able to kind of like coaching their students to almost self-advocate, and being to say like, where do we work together, build that relationship piece so that a student does have that kernel that you're talking about, Corinne, where they can kind of like almost speak to themselves in the best way, so that it almost makes an admissions office job easier to then say like to not have to be a detective either way too. So excited for that to also come across here.
Absolutely. And I think of all the slides that I present, this might be the most important one, and how you can have an impact. And that first piece, as you just mentioned, you're a student's advocate. It is not your job to teach them how to write or teach them grammar or proper punctuation or any of those things. I would say that it is part of your job to edit and spell check and proofread their essay. That's really important. Every student should do that. Every student should have someone who can help them do that. I once had a great student, write something like, "My couch thinks I'm good at soccer," when they meant their coach, but didn't spell check that one. And it's not going to keep out a student that we love, but it's definitely something that can be avoided, especially when they have help from an organization like Matriculate and great advisors. That said, you are their advocate. That's part of your job, but it's not all of it. And the biggest way that I see that advocacy playing out is in the relationship that you all build. I wouldn't even start those first conversations talking about the essay. In addition to being an admissions officer, I'm also a college advisor to 3 students and a sorority advisor to 160. And I never get anywhere when I get a new student or a new executive board by just asking them what their goals are. I need to figure out who they are as a person and how they see themselves in that role or position or class or whatever it might be. So the best advice I can give is to really spend time asking questions about your students' family and friends and daily routine, the support systems that they have in place, what they've been doing in quarantine, for example. I would think of your first job as getting to know them, and then later trying to help them figure out what to write about. Because the more you know them, the more that you can help bring to the table. It's a really personal process, and you can use that relationship to bring out the best in them. And I think that they'll respect you more and open up to you more if the first way that they see you is as a friend and mentor, rather than someone pushing them to meet deadlines or come up with essay topics. Especially right now, I think I'm an adult mostly, but I can still use a friend and mentor in everything that we're going on. And I know that they're probably even in a more difficult situation than many of us. So it's really good to develop that relationship. I give every one of my students, every one of my admitted students, my cell phone number. They text me all the time. And the vast majority of that time, it has nothing to do with Yale or admissions or college. It's really about things going on in their life that they're looking for someone to be there for them. And the more you learn, the more you can then put that into the process with them and make suggestions. And I think that that also goes into this third point, that the more you know about your student, the more you can help them figure out what might be important to write about, or the more you might realize, hey, none of your essays talked about this medical hardship that your family faced, or this job loss. Maybe you should put that in additional information. And you only know that because you've become their support system. I'll also add that it's important to learn and suss out this type of information, because ultimately what we don't want in the application process is for the essays to be a recap of resumes or academics or anything like that. We want to learn things that aren't elsewhere in the file, especially because a lot of schools are going to ask supplements about the academics and their activities. So the more you know them, the more you can provide us beyond that.
Yeah, and I would just add as well on top of that, just to the relationship piece that Corinne was talking about. In some cases, I'll say some students write about really difficult personal experiences, and that kind of vulnerability is really hard. And it is made so much easier if they have someone that they can go to, just a resource, a friend that has that and they have that pre-existing relationship with that person. And so, given that it's a continued effort over 12 to 18 months, over that period of time, you build that trust, you build that relationship, and that then allows the student to open up a little bit more. And I would also encourage that for advisors to really help students be reflective and vulnerable in that process, because that can really help a student in the processing of different life experiences and how that might relate to, and how that impacted them, and how that might relate to to lessons learned from that. And so feeling that kind of comfort, that level of safety with the advisor is so important in order to even be able to then start connecting it to a college essay.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. And I think that we can move on to the next slide. All right, so this is my last slide for a little while. And I really just want to talk about how hard it is to come up with a topic. I think we all know this. If you are someone who sat down and that first thing you thought of was what you wrote about, and a year or two later you still feel like, yep, that was the best thing, I applaud you, because looking back at my college essay, I think it was the worst thing ever written, and I just laugh at myself, and I probably thought that 6 months after I wrote it. But I have also learned a lot of things that I think can help make this a little bit easier. The best thing that I've seen at the beginning, and we're going to talk about some ways to brainstorm in a second, is really just having a student make a bubble with their name in the middle and start branching off different things about them. I think it's very hard for a 16, 17, or 18-year-old to reflect on their life in most cases and say, this is a crazy cool thing that I did, or something really special that happened to me, or this is what I should talk about. I don't think that I knew any of that until I was at least 25 or 26 or had those type of experiences. And if they don't have that unique thing that I mentioned before, that is 100% okay. We don't need the topic to be unique. We just need what they're saying and how they say it to be their own voice and their own unique take. With that said, I always think that students, the best way to come up with a topic is for them to think about something that's important to them or something that they think is most interesting about them. And that can definitely be an experience, a moment. People are complex because if you write about someone else, you want it to ultimately become about you and who you are. But all of those things might have had an impact in some way. And those are great topics to sort of kick it off. I think that it's awesome that the Common App and Coalition application provide prompts, but I don't think that that's where these essays should start from. Because the choice of topic of their choice exists, I'd really just have them brainstorm what they want to write about, those important or interesting things, and see where it goes. And I might even have them sketch out 2 or 3 different topics that they could write about. And if it fits one of the prompts, great. But if not, topic of their choice works too. And that's what we see most often, I would say. And so I would just let the essay kind of naturally flow where it flows.
Exactly. And so kind of like seeing what that actually looks like in practice and for brainstorming and really like, I think the beginning of this project could feel like you're pulling teeth. I think a lot of you are going to be in a situation where you might start working with your student over the summer and they can look at you and say, I have no idea how to start this. I'm almost 99.9% sure that you can't just like look at each other and say cool and then a perfect personal statement will come out. And so really being able to just write and just draft out ideas and be able to talk things through is kind of like how you can make this process manageable, but also have like a real good product at the end that your high school student feels super proud of. And so just going to talk through a few brainstorming exercises. And this doesn't have to be like, as Corinne was saying, that okay, here's the bubble, here's everything that I want to talk about, and just word it out. Sometimes it is just like having your brain work through different paces and different things and kind of like different topics, and then go into a space that maybe something pulls in from there. So some warm-up exercises that you can kind of just use to get your head started. One that's actually pretty neat is kind of like a favorite piece of clothing. What does it look like? What does it feel like? How did you get it? Kind of just like having a student really press and thinking about ways to like write in detail and kind of almost be like a storyteller about like what about an object can you write about to like add feel. A time that they tried something that they've been scared to do. So asking those clarifying questions, really pushing on your students to just kind of like write out what they feel from just like an instant topic. And then again, like a relationship that's important to you, being able to gauge like what's coming through in these exercises that they can maybe pull from for later. So you're really using this stage of the process just to listen, right? You're listening and you're reading, and here's like a real good way to gauge where your student is at, right? So some students might take this exercise and go all the way with it, and you can just like figure out that they're an incredible writer and can write with such like imagery and detail, and it's maybe just kind of like figuring out like what do they need to get into to like get the words out. Or you might have to start from another place, right, where a student really can't write out how they feel with these topics. And so this is for you to also assess like, oh, okay, like how much more support do I need to be able to assist my student? And so again, this isn't an exercise to go like, all right, one thing's over, personal statement should be done in 2 weeks. It's really there for you to kind of like get the pen moving, understand like where your student's at, and just get a feel for what you can do from there. And so like starting from a point like this as opposed to going straight into the prompts could be something that's beneficial for you and your high school fellow.
Definitely. And one thing that I'll also mention is I think the key is to ask those open-ended questions
Mm.
and get the student talking, really getting them thinking about what is, if you may ask them very random question or start on very interesting topics, but it's that line of thinking that's going to really help them um, sort of start putting pieces together. Um, I, there are, as we mentioned, prompts that students could respond directly to. I won't go through all of them. Some of them are just here for your reference. The Common Application is one of the application platforms that students, it's the most common as the name implies, but one of the application platforms that students will use to apply to colleges. And there are 7 different essay prompts. So again, the key here isn't to just look at one prompt and then write about that. That generally doesn't um, illuminate as much about the student. It doesn't sort of allow the student to go through that reflection process if they do start with the prompt and then write something very directly in response to that. And so as Corinne was mentioning, these are here. They're available. You can find them on the Common App website, and the same is true for the Coalition application. You can head to the next, yep, the Coalition application. You can find all of the prompts. The Coalition has 5 different options for the longer essay, but the point of these prompts is it can be a starting point, but it should never be the directive to answer this question. To pick one, pick one of the 5 or one of the 7 with the Common App and just write something directly to that. What is generally more illuminating for us to read about is when a student really takes the time to develop a story, and then oftentimes it will play into one of the prompts that is available. The last option is always for both of these application platforms is to submit an essay on the topic of their choice. So if it doesn't relate to any of the topics, the pre-existing topics, that's totally fine. They can always submit an essay on the topic of their choice.
Have you guys ever read an essay that you can kind of just identify that this student was like saw a prompt and really wanted to stick to a prompt, and it might have hurt them because it was more in a box as opposed to being a genuine piece of writing?
I think we see that all the time. I think that it's a really common discussion in our admissions committee room, actually, that the essay on failure never tends to be the best one that students pick, because it almost ends up being a trap of them bringing out their greatest failures and not necessarily getting to the overcoming piece or the positive parts. And in that case, the student might have been better off just going with the topic of their choice. We actually used to have, I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, there was a topic called, it was about describe a place where you feel perfectly content. And so many students wrote about being in the bathroom that they actually had to get rid of the prompt. So definitely happens.
Yeah. So as yeah, that was that was, and yes, thank you, Corinne.
Perfect segue.
Just trying to keep it real over here.
No, and it's such a great example because I think the prompts are generally well intentioned and want to provide a framework for students, but again, you want to write authentically in a way that just shares your story, and it will come out in a way that's compelling. So in thinking of an essay topic and helping your students choosing one, as we mentioned before, it doesn't have to be the most unique experience that a student has ever had. Generally, we've seen it all as admissions officers. We read thousands and thousands of essays every single throughout our careers, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of them over each year. And so a lot of the topic itself doesn't have to be the only one that we see out of those, however many thousands of applications a school gets. But it does and it should be unique to the student, and it should be unique to their experience. And that's how they can personalize it, personalize their essay in a way that's meaningful. Many students, and I'm a proponent that there isn't an essay that is off topic, that sort of is off limits, or a bad topic. There are obviously some that are overused, and we'll get to that a little bit later. If you can write about even an overused or overused topic, if you can write about it in a way that's really special to your experience, then that becomes quite a successful essay. And so it's the writing itself and the way in which you talk about your experience that is, and how it relates to you, how you've grown from it, that's important. It's not the act itself or the experience itself. Just a part of good, compelling writing is capturing the reader's attention and developing that story over the word limit count that you have. And that's why the personal statement is so great, because it gives you that room to expand, and it gives you that time to develop your story and take it from the beginning, build it up in the middle, and then end it in a really powerful way. So to the example that Corinne just mentioned, we want students to mention and to develop their ideas and to develop their story in a way that then shows a triumph or an overcoming by the end of it, not just sort of leaving things where they are and not progressing through the essay. What is, I think, the most important, and you may have heard this many times, and you will continue to hear this many times, because we as admission officers continue to read these types of essays, and it addresses this third point of playing an active role in your story. We love your grandmother, right? I'm sure you love her too, and you tell us so much about how much you love your grandmother. We can tell about that in your essay, but we are not reading your grandmother's application. And so if you have not heard that example before, again, we love your extended family members, we love your heroes, but we want you to be the hero of your story. And so please make sure you can certainly talk about other people who have had a significant impact on your life. That is perfectly okay, and that is part of your story. But make sure it always comes back to you, what you learned from them that you then ended up growing and sort of taking those values and applying them to your own life. That's the key here, because we want this to be about you. It can be awkward to write about yourself. I understand that, but every moment of the application is an opportunity to share more about yourself, and we just want to see you shining in that essay. I mentioned earlier that students can choose to write about really difficult things, really difficult topics. That is perfectly fine. They don't have to. A student doesn't have to write about overcoming a traumatic life experience. Not every student has a traumatic life experience or any kind of difficult, major difficulty. That's perfectly fine as well. Students write very successful essays on what you would imagine to be mundane topics. One of the best essays I've ever read was about a student walking through their neighborhood. Something that everyone does, but the way that it was written was so thoughtful, and it shared a little bit more about the student's own experience and sort of being a little more vulnerable in what the community meant for them, and how they came to be shaped by it. And so again, students may end up writing about something more heavy, which again, if they do, it is an important part of their story, but we also want it to come out in a way that shows that they have really done a lot of work since that tough experience, a lot of personal growth and reflection, and that sort of comes into this other point here of demonstrating growth. We want students who are then on this trajectory, who want to continue growing and who will continue growing in college, and we see that evidenced in their application, in their personal essay, and in other parts of their application, the tenacity and the grit that they have to overcome situations. We want to continue to see that because that's what we hope students will do. We know college is hard. We know that there are going to be a lot of challenges. And so seeing that reflected in other parts of the application then gives us confidence as admissions officers when a student is coming into our community. And we know that it will be the college transition is difficult for every student. And on top of that, adding academics, on top of that, community life and the residential experience. And so we want to see that growth throughout a student's application.
Patty said something really key here, that sometimes the most simple topics are the ones that connect deeply with the admissions officer or admissions committee. I know that, like Eddie, my favorite essay I've read in the last 4 years, I think, had to do with a girl challenging herself not to complain for a week, and what she learned from that and how she grew. That's something that any student anywhere, any socioeconomic status could have done and could have written about. And we just see so few of those genuine, like everyday experience type essays that it often does stand out and seem very genuine.
I think one of the things that I'm also just hearing from you guys is like everything that we're kind of talking about, like tips and tricks and just to do those things. It's like there isn't like all of that is a tool, right? Like these are all like insights to go like, oh, like I like that. It's making me feel this way. And there isn't really like one specific formula, right? Like you can't do part of X, part of Y, and part of Z to like, and here's the essay that gets you into college, right? It's always kind of like, how are you like genuinely are you taking this? How authentic are you presenting yourself? And just like kind of like always going to that like main thesis point of just like, is this like who you like who are you? Like what do you care about? What do you love? Like what makes you tick, right? And I think the way that I always kind of like read these bullet points and read these things is just like, yeah, like try to like shoot for those things, but like these are the things that are like incentives to go, oh yeah, like this is making me feel some emotion.
Absolutely. I think that you hit the nail on the head there. And I think one of the biggest holes that students can fall in is when they do think there's a formula and they try and put it all in, and then they're trying to put X, Y, Z, A, B, C all in one piece, and it just becomes too overwhelming, and who they are gets lost.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also just wanted to highlight maybe one thing in particular on this slide, and that's just the reflection and insight that is necessary through this process, as we were talking about earlier. The topic itself can be so wide-ranging, whatever student chooses to write about. It's their decision, and the purpose is to get them excited about that topic. Because then a student is really invested in starting the essay in a way that is intriguing and in a way that's exciting to them and in a way that just will jump off the page. That kind of deep reflection, that process and that investment that they put into their work, where again, it may not be their first draft that they've written. They may have changed topics 3 different times before finally coming to that that essay that they really feel confident and comfortable with, right? Like Corinne said, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 different essay topics that a student can start exploring, not just one. And of those 2 to 3, a student starts developing multiple essays at the same time. And then they can identify some of these traits that are most important to them and how it can come about in different stories. They might identify, for example, a trait from that, that failure experience that they had in one essay that they're writing. And you might find something extremely worthwhile from that developing essay and incorporate it into the one that they ultimately select. So again, this writing process is really important because it'll then allow a student to be thinking about writing not in a linear fashion, but in thinking about it as sort of an exercise of jumping from one point to another side, to a third place, and then really bringing it all together.
I know you guys are excited to talk about this next topic of cautionary tales and things that you see very often.
Yes. Okay. So with all that we've said and all that I hope we're kind of hammering home about how there's not a topic that's going to guarantee a student an acceptance or make us fall in love with them, there are some pieces and choices that we tend to see over and over and that do lose their impact. As Eddie mentioned, we read hundreds, if not thousands, applications per year. Last year I read 1,994 applications to be exact. Many of them, when they have the same topic, it's almost like deja vu. And I want to talk about some of those. And now we absolutely have taken students that have written about some of these. Don't worry if it was you. But the way that we kind of think of it is that these topics and these essays generally don't move the needle forward. They act more as a neutral than a positive, and if a student is fantastic in many other ways and their personality and who they'd be on our community or on our campus come through elsewhere, it's not going to keep them out of the class. But if a student is borderline or really needs something to help them get into the class, this topic or these topics aren't really going to do that. So a few that I just want to highlight. Eddie hit on one. I actually always found it funny when admissions officers came to my high school and said, don't write about your grandma. And I'm thinking to myself, do people write about their grandma? Like, my grandma's pretty cool. She is my favorite person, but it hadn't occurred to me to do that. And as an admissions officer, I will say so many people write about their grandparents. And a lot of times I'll actually read a story about someone's mom or dad and all that that parent has accomplished and overcome. And it's amazing. And I want to admit that student's parent. But I realized at the end I didn't learn anything about him or her. So I would really be careful, as Eddie mentioned, in that admiration for a family member. That can absolutely be there. That is actually a good topic or a good starting point in many ways to talk about family and context and background, but it should quickly turn to focus on the student or how that's impacted who they are. Another one that we've been seeing a lot, and I have to think that maybe it's part of some junior English class around the country, is students describing their room or desk or bookcase. Eddie, how many of these have you read? Probably hundreds, right?
Yes.
And like they're using objects as a tool to discuss who they are and just kind of walking through, this book on my desk is important to me or relates to me because of this, or this piece of pottery that I made as a kid relates to this. And that really doesn't give us necessarily what we're looking for or the insight that we're looking for. And so while you could ask me that question that was mentioned earlier about my favorite piece of clothing and where I found it, I would love to go off and talk about that. And I think it's a great way to get a student to start opening up to you. I don't think that questions like that are the ones that these essays should focus on. The other things that we see a lot, the one that I've seen the most over my many years in admissions has to do with this idea of failing to achieve something and then working harder. And we'll see this in many different iterations. So a student didn't make captain of the soccer team or the debate team, or wasn't elected to student government, or they didn't make first chair in the orchestra. And so they worked harder and put in the time and learned stuff about themselves. And the next year they tried out again or they ran again and they did it. That is just such a common theme and topic, and it often becomes really just a resume recap in many ways, that I would steer clear of that if possible. And then the last one that I wanted to mention, and Eddie might laugh at this, is about pre-med. And so this idea of a life-changing transformation. And this doesn't necessarily only apply to pre-med students, but we see it a lot. I would say almost half of our applicant pool is pre-med. And so many students will say, I did a shadow at a hospital, or saw someone that needed help on the street, or I had to have a surgery, or a family member of mine was sick. And that prompted them to have this life-changing idea or transformation and decide that pre-med is the thing. And I think that for me, this is kind of funny because usually the most common change we see during a student's 4 years in college is actually pre-med to something else, generally pre-law, actually. It's very common. And so it's also many, many years away. And so that topic is a hard one, just because it tends to be about the academics rather than the student. And that life-changing thing is often not all that uncommon to what we're reading many times throughout the day or a week. Eddie, do you have any more to add to those few?
Just oftentimes, perhaps at this point, very overwritten is sort of experience abroad, whether it's on a service trip or a mission trip. We see that a lot. And again, there's not that you can't write about those in compelling ways, but it's just if you do choose to write about any of these topics, just know sort of what you're heading into, or if your students, are choosing and want to write about any of these topics, just be aware and know what they're heading into. And it should really be an intentional decision and an intentional choice, because the student is that passionate about a particular experience or whatever it might be and how it relates to them. Again, bringing it back to the student and how it relates to them and their growth. But yeah, those were, we do definitely see those a lot.
Yeah, and so I guess from there, kind of where I want to bring it is that even though we do get a lot of essays with similar topics or themes or experiences, beyond just these, that's okay. The important thing is bringing it beyond just the subject and the experience and kind of bringing it back to the human behind that, the student's personal traits. The topic is really a conduit or something that can be used as a way to show personal traits, but the essay ultimately should be about the student rather than the thing or the topic. And so what we're asking for ultimately, and conversations that we have in the committee room revolve around, is the piece doing more showing than just telling? Are they actually showing us and describing how an experience or an interest has impacted them and what they've done with that? Or are they just telling us that they have that interest and experience? For example, just to kind of put this in perspective, did a student say that they discovered a love of chemistry and that's their topic, but then they used that topic to tell us how they took on a leadership position in the chem club, or that they decided to start tutoring others that weren't understanding, and what that says about them as a person and how they care about other people? Or did the student simply tell us, like, I love chemistry, I love YouTubing chemical reactions, and I took an advanced class? Those different approaches give the admissions committee different insight into the person and the ways that they might engage on our campus. So we're really trying to hopefully have the students move beyond just the topic, if that makes sense. One more piece that I'll address, that idea of having the well-written, genuine, thoughtful essay, that's enough to capture our attention. Kind of along the lines of being unique, a lot of students will attempt to start their essays with something shocking and think that that shock value piece is going to get our attention, but it usually turns into something that they have to overcome rather than that helps them. A couple examples here. When we had that essay, describe a place where you're perfectly content, I had a student, I thought he was really cool and interesting, great grades, great activities, all that stuff. And then he wrote his essay on, it started, Never in my life have I been perfectly content. The last time I was content was when I was in my mother's womb, and then went into graphic detail about being birthed from the womb. Not great, not the way to start an essay, not the visual the admissions officer wants, and definitely something that had to be overcome rather than added to the file, right? So those types of things. A couple of years ago, I read an essay about a student who started, my dad tries to kill me on a weekly basis, and then talked about how they were clowns and did acrobatics and he would throw her into the air. Actually a really good topic, but that shock value first line was like, whoa, what do you mean, hold up, is this kind of a flag that we need to be aware of? So just really, if someone that you're working with is bringing that kind of thing to the table, they don't need it. Advise them away from it. They can write a great essay without trying to shock us into noticing, because we do read every single one of these pieces and we're looking for the person, not this big, crazy story. So that's kind of what I wanted to say on this. Do either of you have anything to add there?
I think that was a lot of detail for what not to do.
I try, you know. So then I guess in terms of your roles as advisors and in this editing process, once the topic has been chosen and the drafts have been submitted, the idea is, how do you edit this essay? How do you keep in mind that these might touch on very personal and significant moments of the high school fellow's life, as Eddie said, but at the same time give valuable feedback and help them shape their essay into a more polished version, but also keeping their voice? I think it's really important that we don't edit line by line, that we ask students questions that prompt them to identify areas that can be improved. We on the admissions side can definitely tell when an essay is written, again, by a 16, 17, 18-year-old, and if it's a genuine and honest piece. We can tell when it doesn't match with some of the later essays. We can tell when it's been overly thesaurused. And I think it's also important to make them feel like they don't need to overshare or share something they aren't comfortable with, but they should write for them, and we're going to understand whatever they're trying to say. Tell them that admissions officers are real people. We have real lives. We have real experiences too. We're not looking to deny students. We're looking for reasons to admit them and advocate for them. And if you keep that in mind, I think that it helps the editing process, helps it stay more genuine in the student's voice. Of course, you should ask the question first, does the essay make sense? Is it student focused? Is it showing the traits that they want to show and giving the impression that they want to give? Is the personality that's coming through who they actually are, not who they think we want to see? Is it organized? Does it flow? Are they trying to kind of stick to one or two themes and not fit in that whole ABC, XYZ gamut, right? Does it make sense for someone who's reading it? And actually, I'd recommend that because you've read this so much, it would be good for the student when they think that they're done or almost done to give it to someone else who knows them well, or even trade it with another advising fellow and have them read it, and just kind of ask those questions. Is it organized? Does it make sense? Does the essay fit the prompt? Is it the student's voice? I think that when you get so deep and far into this process, that might even be hard for you to recognize because you've read it so many times. So just keep in mind that this is a team, this is an organization. You're all in this together, and it's okay to ask to switch or ask for help at that point. Back to that idea of editing, spell checking, proofreading, fixing grammatical and spelling errors, absolutely. I think that that is a pretty easy one to put a check mark in the box when you're almost done here. And does the essay communicate that the writer is a strong candidate for admission? That really goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, that we should not be elevating the student's writing or application to a level where they would not be able to match or work towards that in college. I think that it's really important to do them a service and not a disservice. In the editing process, the best tip that I can give, the most important thing that I can say, is that your job is to delete, but not add. You can say this word is wrong, this sentence doesn't make sense, or I would get rid of this paragraph or move it here instead. But you should never be the one to say, use this word instead, here's a sentence that I wrote, or let's talk about this thing and this way. That's getting rid of the student's voice. So as long as everything that goes in, even if it has to be deleted and go in 3 or 4 times, is their own voice and their own writing, ultimately at the end of the day, this should sound like the student, and that's what we're looking for.
Absolutely. And I'll just make one quick point there as well, where from all of those open-ended questions that you've been asking your students, it's great to continue that here as well. So, maybe something like, how else do you think you can reframe this sentence? Or what word would really capture the how you're feeling and what you want to communicate? Asking those types of questions then brings it back to the student so that they can really think through it and think of what they think is most appropriate, and write about, sort of reframe the sentence or the word in a way that they find to be true to them.
Yeah, I think you guys are just like hitting all this on the head so well. I do think for advisors who are coming into this work and are now going to start working with their first students ever, this is a really weird space to be in. For some of you, this was you a year and a half ago writing an essay to get into school. And so kind of like training your brain to an edit mode is a really hard skill, and always kind of like stepping back is usually the correct call, in the sense that you really want to, again, help your student advocate for themselves, and identifying, a slide earlier said that you're their advocate, not their copy editor. It's saying, I meant to say that you're not just their copy editor. And so it's really kind of you taking these lessons and then just like helping guide your students so that they aren't doing that mistake of like misspelling couch versus coach, and that they're being challenged and are having to answer those open-ended questions and have the opportunities to kind of like discuss what they're thinking, discuss what they're feeling, and like really have opportunities to really improve the statement as a whole. So this doesn't happen overnight for you guys either, but as you work with your students and get more practice on editing, work with your peers on how they're editing their students' essays, talk to each other and really gain insight into like what you're kind of seeing from your pool of students that you're working with, is kind of like how you improve at this role and get better at this job.
Yeah, so we just wanted to sort of end with a few things that we've put together on what we've seen, and we've talked a lot about these through the course of our time together here. But just to reiterate, just as Corinne emphasized, you really want to make sure that that the student's voice and their words are at the forefront of their writing. That's going to be the most important thing for us, to see that genuine voice reflected, because again, we're then connecting that to other parts of the application and making sure that things are in line and that things make sense. And so maintain the authenticity of the student's voice. Ask the student, if they weren't there and someone was talking about you, what would they say? That can be a way, again, to help the student identify who am I? What are the things that are most meaningful to me? What are the things that I have done that have been impactful in my community, and what would someone say about that? Also ask the student, if your essay didn't have your name on it, would someone be able to know it was about you? Or another version of this that I've heard as well is, if I, as an admission officer, had a stack of essays in my hand and I tripped and fell and they all fell all over the floor, and if I were to pick one up, would I really be able to tell that it was you out of these 20, 30, 50 essays? Would this really be able to describe you if this essay didn't have your name on it? Would someone who knows you know this is absolutely speaking about, this student? And again, in order to get that confirmation, a really practical step is to ask the student to have a close family member or a friend read the essay and see if it checks out with who they know the student to be, see if it makes sense and it aligns with what they know. As always, edit, proofread, spell check, and then do that 10 times, 10 times over. You can never proofread or edit too many times, and that's a really important part of the writing process that students will have to understand. And one quick thing that we wanted to mention, we know that students, we're not sure the level of access that students have to a computer or to Microsoft Word, for example, but if it is at all possible, if they can work at their library or their school resource center to write their essay on a computer rather than a phone, there just sometimes end up being some really funky formatting things that come up if a student does then transfer it from something that's written on a phone to when they submit it on the Common App or the Coalition application. So that's just one quick thing. If it's possible, then be mindful of that.
This was incredible. Thank you guys so much for doing this. I think just having your insight into this process is so beneficial for advising fellows. So Corinne, Eddie, thank you. Before I let you guys go, I know we're hitting we're hitting time, but if you can maybe in 30 seconds or less, you were talking about this a little bit earlier, but can you talk about like a personal statement that kind of still sticks with you that you think about, and that you can kind of like maybe talk about like what the narrative was that you just really enjoyed and got to know reading?
Yeah, I think that I'm gonna go back to the example of the student I used earlier, because that really is one of my favorite pieces I've read in many years. And she knows that I love her essay. I've said it a million times. As a student from Nashville, and basically her school had an assignment to not complain for a day, and she was like, well, that's not that hard, I'm gonna not complain for a week. And I think her essay started out as, spoiler alert, it was harder than I thought, or it was that hard, and how not complaining for a week really changed her mindset on how much people do complain or take for granted. And it led her to help co-create a mentorship program for younger girls who had been bullied. And so it really showed not just one experience that occurred and her thoughts on it, but the growth that led to over a period of about 2 years, and the person that who she was. And I knew that if we admitted that student, she would come to campus and bring that mindset. But also I could see her getting involved in the mentorship programs that we have, and the positive influence she might have in our residential colleges. And it really just honed in on who she'd be in our community. And I think that's why it connected so much with the committee, even though it was such a simple topic that any one of her classmates or anyone around the world could have written.
Yeah, and I'll just share and expand a little bit more about the example that I mentioned earlier. One of my favorites has been, this was a student who was a runner and actually had an injury that prevented her from running for a season. And she wrote about walking as an anthropological exercise. She was so used to running miles, and this is something that I don't understand because I've never done cross country or track, but running miles every day around her neighborhood, through her town, into neighboring towns, and just sort of exploring beyond. But when this happened, this required her to slow down, and it actually changed the pace of her life, that then allowed her to reflect and to notice and actually become aware of things within her own community, and sort of some things that she had previously overlooked by just simply running through her community, not paying attention as much. She started paying attention to things, issues that she noticed in her community. And so it was an essay about sort of running and walking and injury and overcoming, but beyond that, it was the thought and the reflection that she had that this experience resulted in, of thinking about her own community in new ways. And then obviously that would translate well. We could see her thought process and her mindfulness of how she wanted to improve communities, and just the genuine approach that she had. So that's sort of what stood out to me and stood out to the committee.
That is absolutely delightful. This is really just an excuse for me to also talk about a favorite personal statement that I really enjoyed reading. But when I worked in DC, I had a student, so he always wore like super nice shoes, and like for the folks that don't know, I'm a big sneakerhead, and I'd always like notice and like kind of like ask him about it, and then like we would always like talk about shoes during the summer. But as I got to know him, he actually would he had like a whole like resale industry almost, and had to connect and was able to just like work through a variety of chains to kind of like be able to buy shoes and resell them, and then in process like also just like help take care of like his little brother, and just like was able to turn this like thing that he loved into a way of like really activating like how he could also like survive. And it was just it was such a great essay because he wrote it in a way that didn't make you feel like you were on the outside like trying to understand this thing that he was doing, but it was written from a viewpoint that was just like so relatable and brought you in and kind of like went through a day-to-day process and just showed like his mentality for wanting to get into that world, and just also just like oozing passion and love. And I still think about that all the time just because it's like everything that I really wanted to read. But you know, I think that's kind of like to show that this will develop over time, and really excited for you all as advising fellows to kind of get to know your students in ways where you can really make the biggest impact. So to close out, next steps, webinar assessment is due next Tuesday, so on the 21st. We kind of use that to really indicate that you're using the resources, and making sure that we can also see that you are filling out the check for understanding. A lot of the spring curriculum units are also ready and available for you to use with your students. I just want to call out that, again, we are truly in an unprecedented situation where a lot of this isn't going to make sense. So making a testing plan is going to be very different for your students right now. There's day-to-day situations that are changing on whether schools are accepting testing and testing scenarios in general. So know that there's a lot of it that could be in flux. But the thing that I'm just going to be really pushing on you guys right now is just to control the things that you can control, and to reach out to your head advising fellows and to staff when you are running into situations that just are, again, unprecedented and need more of a community support system as opposed to you doing this on your own. So again, we're listening, we're keeping an ear on the ground, and but you also need to raise your hand when things are happening. So yeah, excited for you guys to watch this. This is a little bit longer than usual, but really, really excited to hear this three-way conversation. So from us at Matriculate, from Corinne and Eddie at Yale, thank you so much, and we'll see you, or I'll see you next month.